Hey everyone, Victoria here. Today I'm going to be talking about one of the most notable and famous court cases in all of history, Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas. So, what is Brown versus Board of Education? Well, it was a Supreme Court decision that ultimately dictated the end of public segregation in schools on May 17, 1954. To dig in, it can be helpful to understand some context. It's important to be familiar with the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. It says a state must not deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. And prior to Brown versus Board of Education, there was a case named Plessy versus Ferguson, which in 1898 had upheld segregation in public railway cars despite the Equal Protection Clause. The important takeaway from this case and how the court got away with it was that the court decided that segregated public facilities were constitutional so long as the black and white facilities were equal to one another. This is where the famous phrase that you may have heard, separate but equal, comes from. Multiple civil rights groups set up legal and political challenges to racial segregation. A leader who did just that went by the name of Thurgood Marshall, who led the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or the NAACP. He believed that segregation of schools went against the 14th Amendment. The NAACP lawyers such as Marshall brought upon lawsuits on behalf of the African American students and their families throughout multiple states, urging court orders to urge schools to allow African American students to go to white public schools. The school system in Topeka, Kansas, school buildings, materials, and salaries of teachers were almost equal in both African American and white schools. The school system in Topeka followed the law of schools in unorganized counties. That permitted segregation. In 1951, 13 parents took part in suing the school system for the unfair treatment of their 20 children. One of those parents was Oliver Brown, who had schooled the school system in Topeka, Kansas on behalf of his African-American third-grade daughter, Linda Brown. He said that the school his daughter went to, which consisted of all African-American students, was equal to the school that only white Americans went to. Thurgood Marshall argued on behalf of African American families that white schools were superior in quality to African American schools. However, in Topeka, Kansas, the schools were both decent. While the quality of the schools may have been equal, what was not equal was the fact that one school was for white students while the other was solely for African American students. While the federal district court disagreed, they dismissed Brown's claim, ruling that the segregated public schools were substantially equal enough to be constitutional under the determinant of Plessy v. Ferguson. So the Brown case went on to the Supreme Court. It was 1953, and with the case, the justices were divided. So the case was put on hold. The judge who first handled the case was replaced with a man by the name of Earl Warren, and to much of the representative plaintiffs' delight, believed that segregation was unconstitutional. During the time, many individuals in the South were not a fan of integration, and Judge Warren was fully aware, so he knew it was best for the decision of the case to be unanimous where all voters would be in agreement. With the new judge in 1964, the case finally was back on track. Unfortunately, the justices were still divided. Many believed that segregation of schools violated the 13th Amendment, but then there was the other half, who believed that the decision to integrate schools should be up to the states. Judge Warren rewrote the court decision multiple times. So I have a question. How can schools be equal if they are not integrated? This was an ongoing question that those involved in the case had to determine. Finally, Judge Warren came up with a unanimous answer. The decision held that racial segregation of students in public schools went against the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. The court pointed out that Congress, when coming up with the 14th Amendment, did not mean to force integration of public schools, but the 14th Amendment did not go against integration. The court asserted that the 14th Amendment guarantees equal education for all, declaring that the idea of separate but equal in public schools is unconstitutional. While the decision was a unanimous one, a lot of people in the South refused to follow. In later years, schools slowly but surely integrated. Brown versus Board of Education stood in the face of racism and segregation. The Supreme Court changed the state of America by allowing African Americans to go to whichever school they pleased to obtain a quality education. One could say the case eventually led to desegregation in the U.S. Just a little assessment to go over what we learned today. So, what are 3 things that you learned today? Your first 2 should be what you may have found interesting from the material, and the third should be a question that you still have or something that you may not have been covered. An example could be, for number 1, I learned that Thurgood Marshall was one of the founding members of the NAACP and helped to represent the Brown case in court. Number 2, I found it interesting how the case was originally placed on hold. And number 3, I want to know more about the actual case and the arguments both sides made. We've made great strides at it, as it has been over 60 years since the Supreme Court ruled separate but equal schools unconstitutional in Brown versus Board of Education. Thanks for listening.